Northern Ireland had been legally established by the Government of Ireland Act in late 1920. This was the British government's attempt to devolve responsibility for Irish affairs to not one, but two Home Rule parliaments, one in Dublin and another in Belfast. The Dublin Parliament was stillborn, as nationalist Ireland had now moved well beyond limited self-government towards full sovereignty and independence following the resounding Sinn Féin victory in the 1918 general election. However, in the six northeastern counties of Antrim, Down, Armagh, Tyrone, Fermanagh and Derry, the Unionist majority accepted, albeit suspiciously, the offer of a devolved parliament in Belfast. The area designated made no reference to the contiguous waters, which is why Lough Foyle and Carlingford Lough remain contested areas to this day. Ironically, the only part of Ireland not to want Home Rule became the only part of Ireland to get Home Rule. The Government of Ireland Act ordained that the 3rd of May 1921 was the date on which Northern Ireland was to become a separate constitutional entity. The subsequent general election in the north on the 24th of May resulted in 40 Unionists being elected. The split between Sinn Féin and the remains of the Home Rule Party in the north was evidenced by each winning 6 seats. The Northern Ireland Parliament met for the first time on the 7th of June 1921, with a state opening by King George V on the 22nd of June. Both the progress of the Government of Ireland Bill from October 1919 to December 1920 and the negotiations that led from the truce to the Anglo-Irish Treaty from July to December 1921 took place amidst a level of political violence not seen in Ireland for well over a century. Ironically, very little of this violence took place in the area most affected by partition, the proposed border area. The first IRA attacks of the War of Independence took place in early 1919, and for much of that year the violence was relatively sporadic and low-key. The IRA then started to attack Royal Irish Constabulary patrols and barracks, forcing isolated barracks to be abandoned. British troops were originally regarded as acting in support of the civil authority, that is, the police, but early in 1920, the British government established 2 paramilitary police units, the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries, in order to support the police. Both these organisations' reputation for ill discipline and reprisals, allied to the introduction of martial law, led to the escalation of violence in late 1920, which lasted until the truce of July 1921, as the IRA campaign became more organised and militant. The IRA's campaign was mainly, although not exclusively, a southern affair. In the north, despite the rhetoric and drilling at the time of the Ulster crisis between 1912 and 1914, violence never came to Ulster until the summer of 1920. One of the main reasons for this was the continued influence of constitutional nationalism amongst the Catholic population, particularly in Belfast and Derry. The new Sinn Féin philosophy was largely southern and rural, but even in the more rural parts of Ulster, it failed to make much ground. Belfast Catholics had been the least militant of the nationalist population, as was evidenced by their enthusiastic commitment to the British war effort during, in particular, the opening years of the First World War. In the 1918 general election, the Home Rulers managed to fight off the Sinn Féin assault by returning 4 of its remaining 6 MPs from what was shortly to become Northern Ireland. Irish Home Rulers in the north instinctively knew that a campaign of violent confrontation would invariably lead to an increase in sectarianism in which Northern Catholics would suffer the most. Furthermore, such violence would only embolden rather than weaken Ulster Unionist obduracy and control of the province. In contrast to the rest of the country, where the lack of any meaningful political opposition had resulted in the Home Rulers becoming complacent, in the north there was a rival Unionist opposition which required a nationalist permanent grassroots political machine ready to fight for every last vote. A potent political mixture of charismatic leader Joe Devlin, the Catholic Church and the Catholic lay organisation, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, saw off Sinn Féin pretty effectively, with Devlin easily defeating Sinn Féin President Eamon de Valera for the nationalist seat of West Belfast. Consequently, the IRA campaign in the north was largely confined to rural Catholic areas, and even there only gained modest support as a result of the danger of provoking retaliatory sectarian attacks on the Catholic population. All of this began to change in the summer of 1920. Earlier in the year, as the IRA campaign in the south and west gained traction, the incipient Northern Ireland remained largely peaceful. However, in Derry, 20 people were shot over a 7-day period in gun battles between the UVF and the IRA in June. This was followed by the expulsion of Catholic workers from the Belfast shipyards and ancillary industries following the return to work after the 12th of July holidays. This extended to streets around the shipyards and led to 4 days of rioting in which it is estimated that 8,000 Catholics and left-leaning Protestant workers were expelled from their jobs. The immediate catalyst was the murder of a senior Northern RIC officer in Cork, but underlying tensions such as the competition for jobs also complicated the situation. None of the expelled shipyard workers would ever return to work, and this exacerbated the already high levels of poverty and unemployment amongst the Catholic population in Belfast. The heightened tension was increased by the prospect of an extended political certainty as a result of the imminence of partition. Although roughly coinciding with the Irish War of Independence, the sectarian conflict in Belfast between 1920 and 1922 was unique in its characteristics. Unlike the rest of Ireland, which saw essentially a guerrilla war between the IRA and Crown forces, 90% of the deaths in Belfast and its surrounding environs were civilians, either through sectarian assassinations or armed conflict between the two communities. Ironically, the paramilitary organisations such as the IRA and the UVF seemed to be following rather than leading a spontaneous communal conflict. Furious loyalist mobs destroyed over 300 Catholic homes, businesses and religious buildings in Lisburn, County Antrim in August 1920, following the IRA assassination of an RIC district inspector in the town. Over 1,000 Catholics fled to Newry, Dundalk and Belfast, there to join Catholic refugees from the civil disturbance in East Belfast the previous month. This was the culmination of 6 weeks of violence in Belfast and nearby towns, as nationalist victories under the new proportional representation system in local elections, including Derry, unnerved many Protestants in the run-up to partition and led directly to the establishment, before Northern Ireland actually came into existence, of the Ulster Special Constabulary. It was apparent in the summer of 1920 that the existing UVF could not control loyalist outrages. So in July, Winston Churchill, as British War Minister, Police Chief General Tudor and Unionist leader Craig proposed to Prime Minister Lloyd George that the formation of a special constabulary would potentially free up police and military resources in the north. However, loyalists in Lisburn, Lisnaskea and Sir Basil Brooke, later Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, at Colebrook in Fermanagh, had already set up unofficial special constables, all of which were opposed by Sir John Anderson, Joint Under-Secretary at Dublin Castle, as likely to provoke sectarian violence. Craig then proposed to Lloyd George a 2,000-strong special constabulary in September 1920. There were reservations from Army Chief General Macready, who feared civil war, and from Sir Henry Wilson, who wanted the specials under military control. But basically, Craig could now arm Unionists aged between 21 and 45, later extended to the entire male Unionist population, so that he had not only a special constabulary, but also the UVF in reserve, and this was 6 months before Northern Ireland had come into being. The initial fear amongst the Unionist population was that these reservists could be sent anywhere in Ireland, but once it became obvious that they could only serve in their own districts, recruitment began to accelerate. Violence in Belfast peaked again between April and June 1921, a period of intense militant activity by the IRA in the south, but also the time Northern Ireland came into existence and its parliament was opened. There was another peak in November and December 1921 during the treaty negotiations in London and the transfer of security powers to the new Northern Ireland government. Finally, there was renewed tension leading to civil disturbance in the spring and summer of 1922 as the two new Irish states confronted each other for the first time. Belfast accounted for 40% of all fatalities in Ireland during this period, with 500 people killed from July 1920 to June 1922, and 20,000 forced to move as refugees or expelled from their workplace. Belfast Catholics accounted for 2/3 of the casualties and the vast majority of refugees and workplace expulsions. The violence of this period produced more casualties than all the riots of the previous century put together. Such was the level of paranoia amongst Unionists that isolated shootings on the border became attempted invasions by the time the news reached Belfast. Ironically, it was exactly this level of violence that partition was proposed to prevent. Finally, in June 1922, with the outbreak of civil war in the south, political attention was removed from Belfast and it returned to relative normality. By the summer of 1921, it was obvious to both the British and to the Irish Republicans that the final piece in the jigsaw of Anglo-Irish relations, the future relationship between nationalist Ireland and the British Empire, should at least be attempted to be resolved. In the same way as the British government sought to secure its rear by resolving the Ulster question through the Government of Ireland Act, thus removing most of, although not all, conservative reservations there may have been over the whole issue of the threat to coerce Ulster, before tackling the conundrum that was the rest of Ireland, so Sinn Féin and the IRA sought to maximise their advantage through military means in the south of Ireland before agreeing to talk to the British. Irish Republicans seem to have little idea as to what their policy on the north should be. The new Republican Assembly, Dáil Éireann, rarely discussed the situation there, and when it did, it invariably showed its unawareness and ignorance of the subtleties of life in the northern province. In 1920, in response to attacks on Catholics in the north, Sinn Féin introduced an embargo on all goods and services from the Protestant northeast. This Belfast boycott was intended to emphasise Ulster's dependence on the rest of the country, as well as restoring expelled Catholic dock workers back to their jobs. Heavy industries such as shipbuilding and engineering had little business with the South and so remained immune. But banking and other services were severely damaged. Little was achieved in the long term, and the boycott also negatively affected Northern Catholics, who were meant to be the main beneficiaries of the policy, as well as provoking similar boycotts against Protestant businesses in the South. The net effect was to reinforce a sense of psychological partition, that the two parts of Ireland had little in common with each other, which anticipated the decision of the new Irish state to introduce a customs border between North and South in 1923. The July 1921 truce started a convoluted series of discussions between London and Dublin, which meandered on until the following October, when meaningful negotiations began. During these preliminaries, Lloyd George offered De Valera Dominion status such as Canada or Australia, but rejected any unravelling of the Government of Ireland Act, which had set up Northern Ireland the previous year. By the time formal negotiations commenced in October 1921, Northern Ireland was established with a functioning parliament and government. Departmental responsibilities and a security service were in the process of being established in the north while the treaty negotiations were taking place. In effect, a union state was already a reality. Under the leadership of Sir Ernest Clarke, Assistant Under-Secretary for Ireland based in Belfast, the process of administrative partition took place between September 1920 and November 1921. Clarke first completed the reorganisation of the new Ulster Special Constabulary out of the old UVF and local vigilante groups. His creation of a departmental structure and the recruitment of a Northern civil servants led Unionist politician Basil Brooke, later Lord Brookborough and Northern Ireland Prime Minister, to describe Clark as, quote, midwife to the new province of Ulster, end quote. All of this work ensured that a fully functioning government structure was in place by late 1921, when the War of Independence and subsequent treaty negotiations were continuing in what was to become the Irish Free State in 1922. However, the new Northern Ireland found itself with no educational administrative structure based as it had been in Dublin. The new Education Minister, Lord Londonderry, wanted to replace the largely denominational system where the majority of schools were under clerical control. According to the Government of Ireland Act, the new state could not endow any religious establishments, so the outcome was the 1923 Education Act, fully controlled by the new Ministry of Education. The Catholic hierarchy believed that this was an attack upon the Catholic school system, thus adding to their antipathy towards and suspicion of the new northern state. As a result, they refused to participate and subsequently boycotted the new system. Protestant churches were equally troubled by the idea of non-denominational schools prevented from teaching religious instruction. The Unionist government caved in to Protestant protest and in 1925 lifted the ban on religious instruction. This destroyed all attempts at a non-denominational system, as publicly funded schools in effect became Protestant, whilst a separate Catholic system developed simultaneously. The Northern Ireland government also abolished proportional representation in local government in 1921 and in 1929 for Northern Ireland general elections. This most affected the growing Labour movement in Northern Ireland, but also reduced the chances of independent Unionists splitting the Unionist vote. However, nationalists regarded this and the redrawing of constituency boundaries by the Unionist government as discriminating against the largely Catholic nationalist population. Finally, in 1922, the Northern State, arguing the necessity of restoring peace and law and order, passed the Civil Authorities Special Powers Act, providing most controversially for internment without trial. Between 1922 and 1924, 700 Republican prisoners were interned under the Act. The legislation was renewed annually until 1928, when it was renewed for 5 years, and then in 1933 it was made permanent. It continued to be used throughout the lifetime of the Northern Ireland Parliament until 1972, and was used almost exclusively against the nationalist population. Meanwhile, as government structures and legislation began to be implemented in the Unionist North, Nationalist Ireland and the British government negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which established the Irish Free State and led to the Irish Civil War of 1922-23. The treaty contained provision for the formation of a boundary commission, which allowed for the possible redrawing of the border between North and South. The Unionist government in the North refused to participate, but when it appeared that, rather than reduce the size of Northern Ireland, the Boundary Commission proposed transferring parts of the Free State to the North, the new Irish government was embarrassed into an agreement with Britain and Northern Ireland in 1925, which gave formal recognition to the original 6-county border outlined in the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. In Northern Ireland, Sir James Craig was now able to bask in the enormity of what had been achieved. For the first time in 15 years, the security of Ulster's Protestants had been realised and the North's boundaries permanently agreed by all sides. However, the partition settlement, finally agreed in 1925, failed to deal with the unresolved and unreconciled position of 1/3 of the population of Northern Ireland, the Northern Nationalists. The Catholic population was too large to be incorporated into Northern Ireland society, but its very size begs the question, why was there no concerted effort to integrate more fully a defeated population in the light of Craig's quite magnificent victory? Craig made little attempt to be conciliatory to the substantial Catholic population. During the uncertainty caused by the threat of the Boundary Commission redrawing the borders of Northern Ireland, the paranoia and siege mentality of Ulster Protestants began to accelerate. The prime concern was to secure and strengthen the border, and all political decisions were based on this premise. In this, they were left to organise themselves both politically and in security terms by successive British governments. There was a widespread tendency to view 1/3 of the population, Ulster Catholics, as undependable and potentially treasonous. This view was exacerbated by the determined policy of non-recognition of the northern jurisdiction by the Free State. Many nationalist-controlled authorities in the north enthusiastically embarked upon this policy of non-recognition, which was countered by the northern authorities sending in commissioners to run nationalist councils. By April 1922, 21 nationalist councils in the north had been suspended. While the prospect of the Boundary Commission either amending or removing the border remained in existence, political uncertainty remained very potent. In 1925, with the demise of the Boundary Commission and the consequent confirmation of the original partition line, an exhausted peace fell upon Ireland. However, there was no subsequent rapprochement or reconciliation between the two jurisdictions or between the two peoples who lived inside them. The legitimacy of Northern Ireland in the eyes of its Catholic population remained a constant problem. Partition and the establishment of the Northern State had been a victory for Unionists and a continuing reminder of their defeat to nationalists. From the start, the majority of the nationalist Catholic population in the North had refused to recognise the new government. Even when, after the demise of the Boundary Commission, nationalist MPs started to enter the Northern Parliament in the mid-1920s, they did so reluctantly, preferring to leave the role of opposition to Labour rather than assume it themselves. Craig, in particular, had the foresight and common sense to recognise that the future stability of the state depended upon Catholic acceptance of that state. His failure to achieve this in its formative years led ultimately to the abolition of the Northern Ireland government in the 1970s. Yet any attempts at reconciliation were constantly undermined by the sectarian nature of the state, as well as by the permanent irredentism of its southern neighbour. Any gesture or sign of rapprochement between Unionists and Nationalists was constantly interpreted by many Unionists as an unnecessary concession to a traitorous and devious minority. Consequently, Craig and his ministers were permanently in fear of accusations of political backsliding and weakness by their own voters. Conversely, any attempt to pander to Unionist supporters lay the government open to accusations of gerrymandering and discrimination. Southern animosity also contributed to nationalist reluctance to accept the Northern regime. After the demise of the Boundary Commission, Northern nationalist representatives started to take their seats in the Northern Parliament. However, when De Valera came to power in 1932, the influence of Southern irredentism and anti-partitionism in the South persuaded Northern Catholic MPs to once again withdraw and to restart their campaign against partition. Craig's overwhelming ambition was to maintain Northern Ireland's position in the United Kingdom and to buttress partition. In this, he was single-minded and steadfast. After 1925, with the dismissal of the Boundary Commission and the certainty of Northern Ireland's position inside its 1920 borders confirmed, a magnanimous and far-sighted policy would have been to reach out to his Catholic fellow Northerners. However, this never happened. Craig contributed substantially towards building and maintaining Northern Ireland's stability in the early years between 1922 and 1925. But By then he seemed to consider that his major ambition had been achieved, although he remained as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland until 1940. His avowed aim was to maintain Northern Ireland as a bulwark against a united Ireland and inside the United Kingdom. His statement about Northern Ireland being a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state in 1934 may have been a rhetorical response to events in the South. But instead of making a comprehensive attempt to win over the nationalist minority by addressing their fears and apprehension, Craig preferred to maximise his own party support and thus sustain Unionist Party control over Northern Ireland. The criticism of Craig is that he primarily saw himself as a leader of the Ulster Unionist Party rather than Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and never attempted to persuade Northern nationalists to fully participate either in the state or in Parliament. After the mobilisation of Protestant fears and prejudices in order to create the state, the new Northern government was either unwilling or unable, or both, to offer the hand of conciliation to the resentful but substantial Catholic minority inside that state. Craig consistently used the power of the state to further the interests of Protestantism and Unionism, and his unimaginative leadership of a stable Northern Ireland was in stark contrast to the leadership and determination he showed during the unstable early years of Northern Ireland's existence. Ultimately, the consequences of this attitude was to lead 50 years later to the collapse of both the Northern Ireland government and Parliament. Thank you very much.